GI-TOC?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll get started here in just a minute. We're just waiting for others to join very quickly. All right. So we keep on time here. We'll go ahead and get started and let others join over the next couple of minutes as they can. But yeah, no, hello and good afternoon to those and everybody joining us today. My name is Brian Lee, and I'm the head of the Eurasia Observatory here at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. This is the third session of our webinar series focused on future risks around organized crime and illicit markets around the ongoing war in Ukraine. So today's session will focus on control and money. The final two topics that we're going to be covering from our recent policy brief that we released months ago looking at these issues. As you'll know, the previous two sessions covered people, hardware, and expertise, and these took place over the two preceding weeks, and they're both available now online on the Global Initiative's website as well as the YouTube channel. So as mentioned, the webinar series is based on the policy brief, Crime and Peace, the Future of Organized Crime Beyond the Russo-Ukrainian War, which we examined the main issues, actors, and entities around transnational crime and illicit economies that we here at the GI think should be top of mind for policymakers, business, civil society, and other stakeholders that are looking at what's going on in Ukraine at the moment around the war and what is to come. So the brief is based on our extensive research and analysis at the observatory, which was first formed in 2022 following the full-scale invasion. It was first established to look specifically at the impact of the war in Ukraine on organized crime and illicit markets. And since we have expanded it, we're now called the Eurasia Observatory, which we rebranded a couple months ago, where we're looking, widen our focus, look on a wider geographic focus, as well as a bit thematically to look at different emerging crime types, as well as the perpetrators. So as mentioned previously, today's session focuses on control and money. In other words, who stands to profit in a post-war Ukraine? Who's going to be in control of certain sectors and the levers of power? And what should those who are engaged in this environment be prepared for? So, for instance, some of the questions specifically that we've looked at to sort of, I guess you could say, guide this discussion with the panelists is what indicators might confirm Russo-Ukrainian criminal alliance? Secondly, how can European law enforcement do resurgence of Russian organized crime, including for political ends, given that the lack of current cooperation with Russia at the moment? And then also, what are the risks surrounding corruption, not just from construction and corruption itself, but also from money laundering, foreign invested interest, and the purchase. Cool. So to discuss these issues and everything related to that, I'm joined now by four panelists who are experts in their respective fields. The first panelist we have today is Ilona Khmeleva. She's an international lawyer and researcher specializing in global security with extensive experience in both analytical and advocacy work. Her focus includes countering economic and cyber oppression, shaping international legal accountability mechanisms, and strengthening democratic governance. She has a PhD in international law and has also graduated from the leadership program on Ukraine's reconstruction at Harvard University. Currently, she's the secretary of the Economic Security Council of Ukraine and is the country ambassador to Ukraine at the International Sanctions and Export Control Society. The next panelist we have is Brian Mefford, He was a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's based in Ukraine, where he's worked in Ukraine and Eastern Europe for continuously over the past 25 years. He's currently the director of strategies, which is the government relations and strategic communications firm based in Kyiv, and also for his humanitarian efforts to help Ukraine during the war. He was named a Philanthropist of the Year by the Association of Charities of Ukraine in 2023. And as mentioned, I mean, he's been in Ukraine for over 25 years, first starting there in 1999 with the International Development Agency. And he has a bachelor's of business administration with an emphasis on finance and a master's of arts in defense and strategic studies from the Harry Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Columbia. The next panelist is my colleague, Fedia Sororuk, who is the Global Initiatives representative in Ukraine. He's worked in investigative reporting for over 20 years prior to joining the Global Initiative, where he has concentrated on high-scale corruption and illicit activity. And the fourth panelist that we have is Olivia Allison, who's a researcher and consultant, as well as an associate fellow at RUSI and the RUSI Center for Finance and Security. She has more than 15 years experience investigating finance security, both in the private sector and for policy leaders. And her recent publications have focused on how financial institutions implement trade sanctions, third country sanctions evasion and circumvention, as well as Russian illicit finance in the occupied territories of Ukraine. And her ongoing forthcoming work includes a paper on infrastructure and illicit trade in the Black Sea, and then also a project looking at financial institutions' compliance with trade-related sanctions through the sanctions and circumvention methodologies alert research project. So I'd like to people around this today. To get started, I will hand it over to Lena, but just to recap, following this, we will also then be open for a Q&A session after the opening remarks from each panel. So, Lena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian, and really happy and it's a big pleasure to be here today. Thanks everyone for joining. As for the start of the discussion, I would like to highlight several points which I find the most important. First, it's about the persistent criminal divide between Russian and the Ukrainian criminal groups, because of course there are a lot of discussions how this will be developing after the full-scale invasion, maybe during the time of some kind of ceasefire or even more sustainable peace. So in my belief, the divide which happened in these criminal groups between the Russian and Ukrainian side is very persistent, and we shall not underestimate this development. Of course, there are some groups which are cooperating even now, but we shall also keep in mind that there are some other situation which we need to qualify under international and national law. That it's not only the cooperation between some criminal groups and with some financial flows. It's also the cooperation between the Ukrainian groups, then even criminal, and the aggressor state. So under Ukrainian law, this will not only be the general criminal offense or something like this. This also will be the cooperation with aggressor. And here I would like to highlight the second point. It's about the ongoing territorial occupation, because of course our topic today is the crimes after war, but here in Ukraine we also understand that this period after war may also not be the peace in the general understanding, because unfortunately we can say that some territories will be still occupied, and maybe for a long time, and these occupied territories will pose both a big security threat but also a big economic threat for the general situation both in Ukraine and Europe. And here it is important to develop the non-recognition economic policy for these occupied territories, because as you all know, I think that there were a lot of sanctions introduced after 2014 for the occupation of Crimea and some other territories of Ukraine, I mean Donbass. But still, these regimes are not very well developed, and we saw a lot of examples before the full-scale invasion when some Western companies did cooperate and did help the Russian Federation to proceed with this occupation. So I think that the really very good, effective policy of non-recognition of the occupied territories is what we need, but not only from Ukraine, but from the US, the EU, and this policy shall be very much coordinated because it may not be introduced if it is not like coordinated between all the actors. The third, but still very important, is about the investment screening process, and it's more about the question of Brian, who may benefit from the reconstruction. I think that there are a lot of actors who do want to benefit from the reconstruction, but they may not need to benefit from it. I think that a very good notion was incorporated in our recent agreement between Ukraine and the US on the investment fund. So we may criticize this agreement, we may like it, but the idea which was incorporated there about that the states and the private actors who helped the Russian Federation during the aggression shall not benefit from the reconstruction period in Ukraine. This notion is quite important, and I think that we shall fully support it and do our best to proceed. And here, of course, we are speaking mostly about the Russia itself, but also about China. And I think that these actors will try to have the investments in the Ukrainian post-reconstruction process, not only for the economic benefits, but also for political benefits and for some kind of political corruption. We saw it before, and I think that it's a really huge challenge which need to be faced. As for the European enforcement policy and the hardships which we have due to the absence of fully cooperation between the EU and Russia now, even in the criminal cases. I think that the biggest problem now and the biggest mistake is that we still believe sometimes that we can come to business as usual with the Russian Federation, both in the economic sphere and in the cooperation concerning some law enforcement, some other legal process. So in my opinion, it's really it will be very, very hard. So the EU shall not rely on these practices anymore, and we shall build new criminal cooperation process, which will not rely on the Russian Federation at all. But still, we shall somehow proceed with these groups because they are already working against not only Ukraine but also the EU. I may give you just one little example. It's in the sphere of cybersecurity. So we saw that a lot of cyber groups of the Russian Federation who are somehow cooperating with the government and can be attributed actually to the government of the Russian Federation. They are committing a lot of cyber attacks against Ukraine, against the critical infrastructure, but we see that simultaneously the same groups are committing the cyber attacks against the EU countries and also the NATO countries. But the problem here is that the same groups which are being involved into these types of activities which are connected to the national security are also involved in the activities which are generally criminal in their nature. So they combine both some national security aspects, helping the government, and also usual classic criminal activities in the cyberspace. As we cannot draw the line, we shall provide for a more comprehensive approach here, once again, coordinated between different actors. And I also believe that it will be very hard to cooperate with the Russian Federation due to the fact that the new tribunal on the aggression was established recently. And as we have this final decision from the Council of Europe, and as there is a high chance that some people from the Russian Federation will be qualified as those who have started the aggressive war, and we will have this legal decision. I think that cooperation with the state of the Russian Federation, as the aggression is a leadership crime under international law, will be harder and harder, and it's also a notion and a fact, so we shall develop new approaches. And last but not least from my side, it's about the developments mainly in Ukraine and the role of private military companies. I think that we shall not also underestimate this fact because As we see now, there are a lot of actors who would like to develop this, and this also could be, frankly speaking, possible developments and maybe even positive ones, because if we have a strict legal framework in line with the best practices, we may also have the possibility of better oversight for the transfers of arms, etc. So I also think that it's a big legal question which we need to face after the full-scale invasion, or maybe during the time of some kind of ceasefire. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. I think you covered a wide range of issues there that are going to be useful and also needing to monitor closely moving forward, especially looking around economic security, economic screening, and then also the role of private military companies. So I'll hand it over next to our next panelist, Brian. Thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you. Great to be on the panel today. We're all obviously we want an end to the war, and we want an end to the war that's going to protect Ukraine's interests, particularly its territorial integrity and sovereignty. This is going to be a process, but one of the concerns with regard to crime in the post-war environment is I think twofold at least. I mean, number one, you're going to have more than 1 million veterans returning from fighting in combat, modern combat, into civilian life. And are they going to be happy, for example, working at a kiosk? Odds are probably not, because for the most part, soldier salaries are rather decent, above average for the Ukrainian marketplace. Are they going to be happy having defended their country or lost a limb in combat to take a simple job at $300-400 a month? Probably not. So that's one risk. Another issue is a lack of jobs that are available to veterans. The issues of corruption that have plagued Ukraine in the past. My sense is from being in Ukraine is that the tolerance for corruption is not going to be as much as it was before. In the past, there were really two kinds of corruption. The corruption that you did to get by because you had to, right? You had to pay a bribe to a teacher, or you had to pay money, even though the healthcare system is free, and all these sorts of things. So there was that kind of corruption that you had to do to get by, and then there was the big corruption or perceived big corruption. It is big, but the perception can vary. I bribed someone to win a government tender, and I got millions and got rich and so forth. So the tolerance for the big corruption, let's say the latter example, is going to be very low, in my opinion. And if law enforcement is not prepared to decisively weed that out, and prosecute that, so that the public sees that violators are prosecuted, that they do prison time, that they pay penalties, and their money's confiscated. If the public does not see that, I think there is an extreme risk of vigilantism, and private, soldiers coming back, joining mercenary gangs, potentially run by oligarchs, and establishing their own justice system, meted out on the street. A bit of a Wild West kind of scenario, but I do not think it's improbable. In fact, I think it's actually a huge risk. And that's something that we need to be aware of. I mean, just in 2014, for example, when the annexation of the Donbass and Crimea took place, we saw Ukrainian oligarchs, particularly Igor Kolomoisky, who's also an FBI wanted crime official. But we saw Igor Kolomoisky hiring up veterans and putting them into a political party list. And everyone kind of gave it a pass at the time because they said, well, he's keeping Dnipropetrovsk, on Ukraine's side. And he did. I mean, let's give him credit for that. A broken clock's right twice a day. So we will give him credit for that. But on the other hand, of course, he was doing so not from the kindness and goodness of his heart, but he was doing so because he planned to enrich himself and expand his political power, which he did on both accounts. Fortunately, the FBI brought charges against him, and he is under custody in Ukraine right now for other violations of the law. The other thing to take into consideration is when there is a end to the to the shooting and to the combat phase of the war. There are still, according to the United Nations HCR, 5.6 million Ukrainians abroad. And so depending on what the population of Ukraine was before the war, I mean, we don't know because there hasn't been a census since 2001, but let's say 36, 37 million pre-war, and you figure almost 6 million abroad, so that's 1/6 abroad. That's rather significant, but it's already been more than 3 years, and a lot of those people have become very comfortable in Europe. They're working in Poland and Germany and the Czech Republic and elsewhere. They have their own lives. They've learned to adapt and make money, and families have been separated for more than 3 years. So what I'm saying is the reality is a lot of those families are not going to come back to Ukraine. Yeah, sure, they'll come back to visit and this and that, but their lives are now in Europe. So that's going to have an effect also on Ukraine. It's going to change the labor market. You may see some labor shortages. That's something else that needs to be considered in the context of what effect that will have with regard to corruption. And then, self-interest has played an important and I think key role in helping Ukraine overcome problematic corruption issues. I mean, in the past, it's no secret, Odessa has always been a criminal city. They have a museum of contraband in Odessa, to this day. It's always prided itself to a degree on the fact that there's a lot of illegal things that go in and out of the Odessa port. Now, what we saw before the war was that there were certainly negotiations between, the Russian mafia and the Odessa mafia, which is the kind of premier Ukrainian mafia, let's say, on, when we come in, stand down, it's going to be 3 days. Just, we love Odessa too. Let's all get along. Let's all make money. And that was the initial approach of the Russian mafia to the Odessa mafia. What the Russian mafia did not count on, as well as the Russian government. One can say that the Russian mafia and the Russian government are one and the same, but they did not count on the fact that Ukraine would resist, and Ukraine resisted quite well to the point that after a week or so, the Odessa mafia sent word back to the Russian mafia. It's like, yeah, that deal we had, deal's off, and because they realize ultimately it's better to be a big fish in a small pond than a medium-sized fish in a big Russian pond, which gets eaten by the Russian sharks, which are much bigger. We've had that example in American history with the Battle of New Orleans and Jean Lafitte, a pirate who the Americans persuaded to join their fight against the British invaders, and it led to Andy Jackson's great victory in the Battle of New Orleans in 1814 and his political career and so forth. Those are the ideal examples of the mafia moving to the good side, so to speak, moving out of the dark. There was also, American and Italian mafia cooperation during World War II, which helped to defeat the Mussolini regime. So there are instances where, mafias can do something good. We will see what will be the effect in Ukraine with the mafias that have been involved in Odessa, or even the mafias that smuggle illicit cigarettes, contraband cigarettes into the European Union. And there's different schemes for cigarettes in Poland, different schemes for Hungary, different schemes for Moldova, and different groups are running that. So that's something else that also is going to need to be tackled in the post-war environment. Mafias are like insurgencies. Insurgencies, the locals, they're going to side with either they're going to choose which side they're going to be on by who they think is winning and who's going to win. And so as long as Ukraine is perceived as winning, protecting itself, that gives Ukraine a much greater possibility of tackling some of the issues related to corruption and mafias inside the country. I don't even address the Russian mafia in hopes that the continued non-tolerance of all things Russian, particularly its mafia, its corruption, its genocidal regime, continues after the war. But I will stop there and answer questions later.
Thanks, Brian, for those insights and also your take on what's been going on around organized crime and corruption there over the past several years. Now move on to Fidir.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for having me, and thank you to the other speakers, because I actually want to start a sort of discussion with them and the other people that are here. I will focus on Russian organized crime's possible return to Ukraine. In some places, it hasn't really left, and Ilona mentioned that. I also want to focus on the role of law enforcement. So before the full-scale invasion, post-Soviet OC groups led by Russians and Ukrainians were the largest criminal ecosystem in Europe, as we know. They dealt in everything from fuel and tobacco to heroin and people, spread their influence all over the world in different continents. Everyone involved was happy, getting rich fast. It was good. Got a little more complicated during the first stage of the war in Ukraine in 2014, when the Russians extensively started using their criminal proxies in the Crimea and the Donbass. They were a very important factor during the annexation. Nevertheless, afterwards, Russians and Ukrainians, the criminals, continued to cooperate both openly and freely, with corrupt officials happily joining in, using both old ties and newly found opportunities in Russian-occupied territories and elsewhere. The full-scale invasion in 2022 was very different. Now we saw substantial rifts in this huge alliance. The partial break between Ukrainian and Russian OC groups led to the reshaping of ties, routes, businesses, and commodities. I would be very skeptical, actually, about this break being voluntary. It wasn't about patriotism. I think it was mostly about survival. It seems, for the most part, it was forced after long and serious talks between the leaders of Ukrainian OC groups and Ukraine's Secret Service. Those that didn't comply had to leave. Those that did were told to keep quiet and got the green light to do small-scale stuff to keep them afloat. Ukrainian law enforcement agencies can be very effective when they want to. And I want to stress this, when they want to. Because when they don't, they tend to return back to being business-like limited liability companies like the SBU's notorious K or contraband department, focused on profits, protection, and market shares. Traditional crime started to really suffer. It was a lot cheaper and more effective to either seek new business opportunities elsewhere or change your modus operandi. And that's what the smarter criminals actually did. They managed to change. They learned new and improved some old techniques and skills, which have provided them with more profits than those they had before the invasion. According to our research, draft dodgers, synthetic drugs, scam centers, and smuggling have become the top 4 most profitable illicit businesses in Ukraine. Everyone is in on the dodger trade, from doctors, military, to border guards and thieves in law and ethnic criminal groups. Synthetic drug production in Ukraine is booming, with the market overflowing with supply and exports to other countries on the rise. Scam centers now employ as many people as banks. Smuggling involves an array of goods, from iPhones to cars to grain, especially grain and timber. There's also another trend. Illicit business is on the move from the east to the west and south of Ukraine. The obshaks, this word means a criminal money pot, are transferred from Kharkiv and Dnipro, the cities who are close to the front line in the east. They're transferred to Lviv and Uzhhorod in the far west of the country. These money pots are used as investments, not just into businesses, real estate, and construction, but also they are a potential financial source during future elections. Given so much has changed, the question is whether the Russians will ever be back. Is the old crime model dead? And this model needed these post-Soviet partnerships. Or after the war ends, will criminals quietly set aside the patriotic talk and go back to things how used to be? Here it's worth remembering one crucial thing, a thing we all know. Crime only really cares about money. It doesn't really care about borders or nationalities, only profit. It should be the other way around with those who are meant to fight it. And I think that's one of the key issues. Today, it might be unthinkable of Russia having any influence in Ukraine after the war ends, but we should remember that money talks. The large-scale infiltration of power structures and institutions by organized crime in pursuit of its own gains and interests has always been an ever-present reality in Ukraine. In the past, we have had numerous MPs, heads of law enforcement agencies, ministers, not to mention a former president, found guilty of criminal ties. A lot of these ties were Russian. What makes us think that this will change? Russia will not go away anytime soon. The question is, will it be back to business again or not, and how soon? Now, with OC groups being one of the few sources of substantial financial might in this period, it is even more so the case. Getting their hands on massive government financing and procurement during the Reconstruction period, assisted by corrupt officials, will only strengthen them and their reach. In a latest poll, Ukrainians picked corruption as the #1 problem facing the country. Even constant Russian airstrikes and bombings ranked second. And that, it seems, hasn't changed a bit. But it is exactly this that needs to be changed the most. Without real law enforcement reform, the agencies which should be keeping OC, Russian OC included, and corruption at bay will feel overstretched and unhappy with their limited control. Left untouched, they will be even more dissatisfied with their limited ability to get a traditional cut from illicit activity. Coupled with the return of a very hungry old and very ambitious new OC, this may be a Molotov cocktail ready to set fire to a war-torn country. Will Ukraine be able to overcome this obstacle, survive and sustain itself as a democratic state? The recent history of the country gives reason for both pessimism and optimism, but it's definitely a fork in the road. And maybe, just maybe, the defining factor will be a fundamental political decision or shift, if you will, in Ukraine's newly formed, numerous, and influential veteran community already mentioned here. Probably this community is the best and most efficient deterrent to any Russian OC coming back and reinstating itself in Ukraine. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if you do, and I think that's a very good addition to what the previous two panelists had talked around as well. So I think that leads us well into our fourth panelist, Livia. So I'll let you take the floor now.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the previous panelists, because it's a bit easier to go at the end once you've heard what everybody else has said. And everybody has made very good points, and we've covered a kind of very wide range of topics. And I will continue that pattern by touching on a couple of different things that are also, fairly disparate in their kind of geographic coverage. So first I want to talk about, we have a part of the questions that are for this webinar, which are around what can Europe do to combat Russian organized crime and illicit finance. And so I wanted to talk about that. And then finally, I will also touch on a couple of things that I think are important domestically for Ukraine as well. So first, I think one of the things that we have really focused on in Europe and in NATO countries when we're thinking about Russian illicit finance has been really focused on the networks that we were already aware of, especially at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So there's been a lot of focus on the named individuals, implementing the sanctions, and really looking at things we're basically already known. And I think there is not enough focus on the new networks that are emerging, specifically benefiting from the war, particularly post the full-scale invasion. A lot of my work is focused on the occupied territories and how Russia's economy works in those regions, and also the networks and people and companies that are making money from that. And there are a lot of obstacles in relation to really making a good policy and really tracking who those actors actually are. So one of the issues is that the sanctions on occupied territories are, Ilona already touched on this, they're not well implemented. They are not consistent across the different EU, UK, and US regimes. And I think, they just haven't had the focus that they need to have if you really wanted to cut down on trade to, from, and relating to the occupied territories. So if you take the EU and US sanctions, they really vary in terms of what the kind of embargo or what's actually banned. They're not full embargoes, and I think that they need to be full embargoes. And then also the US has not extended the sanctions to cover the newly occupied territories as well. And so you have a lot of trade that basically, if people really look into it, is legal, and it's very complicated. And I think that reduces the amount of deterrence that you see in the private sector. It's very important for the private sector, if they're going to be doing screening, if they're going to be looking at their counterparties and making sure that they're not trading with these territories, it's very important that the sanctions are as straightforward as possible. And a lot of the companies that are trading with and doing business and benefiting from really vast corrupt contracts in the occupied territories are operating straight from Russia. B, almost none of them are sanctioned. And so they're basically able to operate completely without any kind of scrutiny. There are other similar networks. This could be the networks that are trading Ukrainian grain that's stolen from occupied territories. It could also be the networks of companies. There's been a lot of focus on the ships, the networks of companies and people and elites that are involved in trading Russian oil above the price cap has also not had the scrutiny it should have. Russian steel and coal and other sanctioned commodities, technically sanctioned, not really enforced. It is very, very hard to implement the trade-related sanctions and anything that's a blanket geographical sanction compared to a list-based sanction, but it's still, I think, very important that we do better on that because a lot of the networks that are benefiting from that are not necessarily related to the household names that we've all started to understand, the Russian oligarchs, et cetera, the people that have had the focus in the past. And these are, powerful and influential networks that without the ability to crack down on them through sanctions and through other policy mechanisms are basically able to send money around the world completely with impunity and without much scrutiny. I think this is important for Europe in terms of funding disinformation, hostile kind of hybrid activities, because Russia has a pattern of using occupied territories, places that it's occupied in the past, to kind of act as kind of forward operating bases, especially for economic crime in new hostile activity. So in the occupied territories in Ukraine, the first bank to operate in occupied territories was in South Ossetia. Abkhazia was also used. These are occupied Georgian territories. Abkhazia was also used for trading coal from the Donbass for a long time. And so you use these kind of gray area territories to participate in illicit finance in other regions. And I think that will come to affect Europe and affect NATO countries in the future and already is and doesn't get the scrutiny that it needs. And then finally, just a couple of quick notes on the Ukrainian issues. I think I agree and support everything that others have said. I think an important thing, this is probably a really obvious thing, but I think we need to think about it. There was a lot of kind of colossal effort to work on building new institutions, anti-corruption institutions, previously reforming some of the law enforcement agencies. And because of the existence and the importance of the external threat to Ukraine, a lot of the energy and scrutiny and focus has gone on to Russia correctly. I mean, Russia is a really important external enemy, but that also means that A, there's a lot of dissatisfaction, which others have already mentioned. B, there's a lot of things that people know about but have chosen not to publicize about what's going on inside of Ukraine because of the importance of the external enemy. And I think it means once there is an election campaign or after any kind of ceasefire, regardless of even the perceived justice of that potential ceasefire, a lot of that pent up energy that is critical of the institutions and the newly emerged and the old organized crime and law enforcement corruption networks that exist, a lot of that will kind of roar back. And it will be, I think, very disorienting for a lot of international audiences who probably haven't been hearing the same level of critique that they may have heard, for example, before 2022. Before 2022, there was very vibrant critical press and there was a lot of things that were covered. And I know a lot of people just believe that they need to be focused on Russia. And I think, that can be a correct decision for Ukrainians, but people might be taken aback by how much negative stuff is going on. And I think, I guess one mantra to maybe consider is, a lot of this stuff, things that come out are not necessarily new, just because it's called news. And so I think, you will have basically 4 to 5 years pent up corruption stories that come back and it will probably feel disorienting, but it's also, I think, an important process of transparency. Just because the amount of reports and prosecutions or whatever else comes up, it doesn't mean that the corruption situation is actually getting worse in that moment. And I will end there.
No, thank you very much, Olivia. I think that was a good way to round out and what we've been talking about, the 3 other panelists spoke on, especially around corruption, and then kind of building on that, what's looking at the occupied territories. And we will now move to the Q&A session, and we do have an initial question here. Looking at the question here is, which EU member states related organizations and their central bodies have been liaising well with Ukraine, especially looking at when it comes to issues around money laundering, illicit finance, and corruption. I think this one, Elaine, I know you talked quite a bit about these related issues, looking at economic security and that. Do you want to have a first go with that?
You can say me. Sorry.
Sorry, Ilona.
Ilona.
Yeah, and then we can, Olivia, if you have some things you'd like to add, feel free. So
Yeah, then I will start. I think that I have just two brief points here. So first of all, as Ukraine is in the process of the European integration, so we are cooperating more and more with different authorities in the EU. And also now, as you may know, the screening process is ongoing concerning the Ukrainian legislation and the EU legislation in different chapters of the European integration process. So our ministries are doing a quite good job given the ongoing war with this. So I think that yes, it's good, but still we are not a part of the EU still, and hopefully we will be in the coming years. But as of now, I don't think that a lot of European authorities do have the jurisdiction concerning the crimes. So for some crimes, yes, they do, but still, Ukrainian national authorities have a very huge homework to be done, if it is, it can be called so. And I think that we shall not rely only on the international cooperation here, because actually it's in the interest of Ukraine to do this job. And our economic security strategy was developed and till 2025. So as of now, we don't have the current document, and I hope that our government will provide and present the new one, which also will incorporate these new problems. Because even if we are talking about the sanctions evasion, so Ukraine has recently criminalized this, and we will be working together with the EU on this process. But still, I think that these processes are synchronized, but still very much developed at the national level. So we shall also do a lot by ourselves.
thanks, Ilona. I don't know, Olivia, you have something you'd like to add to that?
I think, I mean, behind the scenes, I think there is a lot of discussion about a lot of these issues, but I also think that and correctly, again, I'm not critiquing necessarily the focus on the external enemy, but a lot of the kind of oxygen of the diplomatic channels has been used up on, supporting Ukraine and helping them to deal with the war. And so I think that is one of the big challenges, is how to shift some of the discourse to these other areas there's also been there are new institutions that have been set up, or maybe that have been given a lot of power. I'm thinking around the mobilization networks and things like that have not historically been part of the scrutiny from these international like EU member states and so on. And a lot of the centers of power have shifted slightly during the war, and particularly since the full-scale invasion. And I think that will also have to be an important vehicle for diplomatic discussions as well.
No, thanks, Olivia, on that. I think we'll move on to the next question we have, looking at, some of y'all talked about sort of the cooperation between Ukrainian and Russian organized crime prior to the war, and then how that's gone since the war. So the questions we have here is, are there any specific instances where we have seen that they have been continuing to cooperate since the full-scale invasion? I guess looking at what's going on in Ukraine, as well as other instances potentially outside of Ukraine as well. Because one of the things that was mentioned was crime groups go after profit. So I don't know if you touched upon that. Do you want to? That I know, Brian, you'd also touched upon that as well. I don't know your experience in Ukraine.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. Let me just give you a couple of examples, not to go do any deep dives or go further. So, say Ukrainian drug groups, they sell their product on Russian platforms, deep dark web platforms, and through Telegram channels that are owned by the Russians. Another example would be call centers who are cooperating with the Russians and getting the money out of Russia that they scam out of Russians, and plus using Russian crypto platforms to exchange the money for crypto. So that's just a couple of examples, and war hasn't changed anything in that regard. And I mean nothing. Thanks.
Sure. Just to echo Fadir's comments, again, the motivation, the motivation is profit, not patriotism. And these organized crime groups, just as we see the Russian army adapting, every time we find a way to stop their attacks or their drones or this or that, they adapt, and they do a different combination of drones or this or that. So in the same way that they're persistent as a military force, they're also persistent as a criminal organization. So they're never going to stop trying. They're always going to come back. Okay, well, if that's not enough money, what is enough money? Okay, we could give up, our heroin trade in exchange for, this or that. So you can be sure that they're trying. That is an absolute certainty. I think for the most part, they're not having the same success they had pre-war, obviously. One other thing I would just note is that they are, intentionally, the Russian side, intentionally targeting the delivery of drugs near the front lines in an attempt to make it easy and available to, Ukrainian soldiers who are stressed and traumatized by being on the front lines. And so when they get a few days of rest, drugs are easily available in the east and south. The Russians, it's a win-win for them because one, the criminal organizations make money, and two, the soldiers then are no longer as effective as they would be if they were drug-free. So that's just something else that we've seen as another threat and another example of Russia trying, if they can't get in the front door, they'll go in the back door.
Thanks, Brian. Lorna, I know you had also talked about this. I don't know if your work on sanctions evasion, if you've seen any sort of cooperation between Russian organized crime and Ukrainian criminal groups or not.
So as of now, we don't see the particular examples. So there are like two types which could be potentially connected with this. I know that there are a lot of Ukrainian nationals who are put in the Ukrainian national sanctions lists. And there are also big debates in Ukraine whether it's in line with the rule of law or not. I think that it's a part of a bigger discussion. We shall not start it just now because it can take hours. But generally, we still see that some politicians, so previous members of parliament, even were involved in the pro-Russian activities, and they were both part of this oligarchic system and of the corruption system. So they were a part of the crime system, criminal system of Ukraine, but also they did cooperate with the Russian Federation and did their best to help the Russian Federation to proceed in Ukraine. It's like the one example, and the other example is also, I think that Fedor has mentioned that Ukrainian and Russian criminal groups are very much interconnected and very, very much interconnected before the full-scale invasion. So this is why we sometimes see that Ukrainian-born people and sometimes even Ukrainian nationals could be part of the procurement schemes for the evasion of the export control or sanctions limitations against the Russian Federation. So we do see it. They are also sometimes in the Ukrainian sanctions list. Sometimes they are under investigation both in Ukraine and in the EU. I cannot say that it's really a huge problem as of now, but yes, we do still have it.
Thanks, Ilona. I guess we'll move on to the next question here. Looking at one of the members of the audience asked about a scenario in, say, any number of years, 5 to 10 years, let's say, that we see trade between Russia and Ukraine. Somehow they rekindle that relationship and they are trading things. I think looking here, is there a scenario there during this that Russian criminal influence might start to grow in Ukraine again? I mean, I think that's something that all four of you all touched on in one instance or another. But so do you guys see, first off, trade coming back between Ukraine and Russia? And then secondly, would that be an opportunity for Russian criminal influence to grow in Ukraine or to return to Ukraine, you could say? I don't know, Olivia, if you'd like to touch on that. I know you work on the occupied territories, and that might be one step into full cooperation there or something along those lines.
I think a lot depends on how any negotiated settlement is achieved, but I can't imagine that normal trade will resume, as in legal from the Ukrainian perspective, trade between Ukraine and Russia. There has often been smuggling, and there was, Ukrainian business that was operating in the occupied or annexed parts of, Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk before the full-scale invasion. And so there's always been, some level of irregular trade across that line, regardless. And so I think that, there's probably would resume once it becomes physically possible to do that. And a lot of times that is kind of it's capitalizing on economic differentials between the two sides, right? So if you have products that you can't get through the Russian route, then you would potentially smuggle them from Ukraine, for example. That I'm thinking about maybe European products or something like that. And you do have some level of ad hoc economic activity anyway between Ukraine and Russia. You have people who help pensioners get their pensions, Ukrainian pensions, inside of occupied Ukraine. There's people who go up to the border and try to pick up Ukrainian mobile signal and then, do various economic activities to help people get money. I mean, that's largely humanitarian, but these are kind of economic links that link the people still between the two areas. But I would say that I don't think that you necessarily need the normal trade to be resumed in order to get Russian criminal influence to start working in the country. I don't think that those two are necessarily tied. So I think that, I think Russian criminal influence will resume as soon as possible. And to some degree, panelists have already mentioned various influences that already may be there. And I just, I don't think that those are necessarily tied. The regular trade is not necessarily linked to the criminal influence, and criminal influence is likely to be way ahead of any normalization of trade between Ukraine and Russia.
Thanks. I mean, Ned, Fidio, you wanna?
Yeah, I agree completely. I agree with Olivia, and I think the criminals will be the first actually to start some sort of trade. But I see another problem. This will be the moment when different sorts of schemes will be thought of and used. And the problem is, will these schemes be semi-legalized then and at a certain point legalized? Just like it happened in 2014. Everyone was talking about the coal trade, okay, from the occupied Donbass. Everyone knew about it, but it was there and it wasn't. And that's how it all starts. The problem is, will these illicit basically schemes be legalized, just like the gas trade between Russia and Ukraine? It was always this scheme sort of thing. It wasn't really, two countries trading. There was always someone in between, and that's how it always starts. So if we see this, that means the temptation is stronger than the kind of punishment you can get, and that is the time when you have to beat the guys with a stick to beat them down, because if one guy can do it, then another guy can do it, and everyone will make money and be happy again. Thanks.
Thanks, Fidio. I think we'll move on to move on to the next question. I think this is kind of pertinent as well, looking at the Ukrainian Recovery Conference coming up over the next couple of days. So combine a couple here of looking at reform measures, especially looking at stemming the growth of organized crime, as well as, through stemming the growth, kind of cutting off opportunities, providing, I guess, other opportunities as well for those to not go down the road of joining into criminal activity, but instead finding a work in the illicit marketplace and things along those lines. So I guess this is a good question for all four of our panelists here of what would be the top 2 or 3 reform measures that you would recommend to stem the growth of organized crime and criminal activity in Ukraine. Now as we're looking towards recovery and reconstruction later on down the road.
So maybe I will start, and I think that so maybe a step back from this. Once again, when we're talking about the crime, which could potentially be developed in the post-war Ukraine or during the ceasefire, so we shall also look at the reasons of this crime. And I think that the part of the hybrid war of the Russian Federation is actually the economic warfare, and the part of this economic warfare is actually building this crime system and corruption system, corrosive capital in Ukraine, both for developing some political and economic influence. And that is why I believe that one of the reforms which is crucial is the investment screen reform in Ukraine. Not letting these investments of the Russian Federation to come back, actually, especially in the critical sectors of Ukrainian economy. And it is very sad that Ukraine doesn't have a law on investment screen at all as of now. And I think that we have less and less time for it to be developed because, as we know from the experience of other countries, sometimes it takes up to 5 years to implement. This legislation, at least it was what we were told at the FCDO. So this is like the British experience. I think that the British system is far more better for the implementation of law, etc. And I think that the second reform maybe not very very much connected with this, but still it's very important. It's about the parliamentary oversight and post-legislative scrutiny in Ukraine, because this instrument actually goes very important, and it gives both business and citizens the instrument to give the parliament their reactions on the laws which were introduced and which will be implemented. And I think that it's a really good instrument also to stop some crimes from being developed. And in Ukrainian system, we don't have this very good and very well developed still. And I think that we need to work more on this. And also because the parliament will have a leading role in the post-war recovery, hopefully. Because as of now, our system is very much centralized, let's call it this way. But when the war is over, or at least when we have some kind of ceasefire, we will need a lot of democratic reforms, and post-legislative scrutiny and parliamentary oversight will be crucial.
Thanks. Brian?
Sure. Just to echo Alona's comments, yeah, absolutely. With regard to Russia, that is it's a cancer on Ukraine, and you introduce cancer into your body, you're going to get cancer. Maybe one time you knock it back, maybe a second time, but you keep introducing cancer into your body, you're going to get cancer. So yeah, the tough sanctions that designate Russia as a terrorist state, they need to stay on the Ukrainian side to keep that cancer out. The economy and trade and society in general, they need to be treated just as Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram. These are terrorist organizations, and they should be treated as such. The other thing, though, is since 2014, the West, the European Union, the United States have invested heavily in anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine, and there was much hope for the NABU and the NACP and so forth, and they have done some good things in terms of transparency, but probably more. But to date, they have not put any big fish in prison. Yeah, they'll get a judge here and there, or they'll get this person or that person, the MP. But to date, they have not gotten any of the big fish, and as a result, if you look at the trust in those agencies, both before the war and now, they're heavily negative. They're not trusted because they're not seen as effective. I mean, having been in Ukraine 26 years, I remember the Orange Revolution, of course, and people loved Yushchenko at the time because he said, if I'm elected, I'm going to put the bandits to prison. Bandits will go to prison. And people said, all right, we want that. And then when the bandits didn't go to prison, the disillusionment set in. And again, back to my original point, with disillusionment after the war, that can easily lead to vigilantism, which is not going to be good. Lawlessness that the state might not be able to control. So that is a real danger that must be tackled. So give teeth to the existing anti-corruption agencies, streamline the laws so that they are able to more effectively do their job. There's this broken, tin can telephone between, NABU and the special anti-corruption prosecutor and the NACP and this and that, and there's all these excuses, but there's no results. And ultimately, the public is not going to have an intolerance for that post-war. And then finally, I know that there's always the argument, well, but we got the war, we got to, we got so much on our plate right now. We got to, do this, we got to do that. We'll pass all these laws after the war, right? We'll pass these anti-corruption measures after the war. I believe that's a red herring, and I'll just give you an example. Abraham Lincoln didn't wait till after the American Civil War to free the slaves. He did it in the middle of the Civil War. Why? Specifically because in wartime, you can make radical changes to society. And so the radical anti-corruption reforms that need to take place for Ukraine to integrate smoothly into the European Union, those changes to the law need to take place now. If the economy, post-war, if there's peace, and the economy is growing at 5-6%, and lots of reconstruction money's coming into Ukraine, people are going to say, things are pretty good now. Let's not mess it up. So now is the time to pass those tough reforms and, take the castor oil, take the tough medicine now.
No, thanks, Brian. I'll pass over very quickly to Fidia if you have a couple comments there.
Well, I did mention sort of law enforcement reform. I know it's a tough issue, but I think what proves that it's important is this competition we have with the Bureau of Economic Security. This competition that they've supposedly chosen the guy who's supposed to head the Bureau, but now they've decided that he won't head the Bureau. So you can see the importance of these agencies that deal with the economy and financial crime and financial issues. Everyone wants to deal with them. But according to the new structure of law enforcement, this is the agency that is supposed to deal with it. And you can see just how hard it is to actually make a decision that kind of shows you the way for this agency, how it should operate, and it should operate independently and efficiently and effectively, not in the interests of certain people, so to say. Also, I think Ilona mentioned this unbalanced power structure that Ukraine has now when basically agencies that are not even mentioned in the constitution have an overinflated influence, and parliament, which is supposedly, one of the pillars of democracy in Ukraine, has this diminished role. So I think that is one of the things that we need to look into. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fidia. And Olivia, I'll hand it over to you for you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, everybody has already covered all of the points that I wanted to say. I think two things. One is dealing with Russia. Two is dealing with the internal institutions and making sure that they properly work. But I don't want to repeat what others have said.
No, thanks. I know it's glad to follow, but I know we're now just briefly over time, so I just wanted to lastly, thank everybody for joining. Our panelists, great job, and thank you for joining a great last session of the webinar series, as well as to those participating online. As mentioned, this is the last of the three-part series. This will be available online shortly on the Global Initiatives webpage, as well as the YouTube channel. So if you guys want to watch it again or different parts of it, feel free. We also have the previous two sessions available now as well. And also just, to keep up with what's going on at the observatory, feel free to go to our webpage and sign up for our newsletter that'll keep you up to date on publications, news and updates that will be sent out regularly. And if you do have any questions or comments, feel free to follow up as well and reach out to us through the website. So again, thank you all for joining, and thank you again to our panelists for making it a great final session today, and hope to see everybody soon.